Time remembers its heroes in song, but it whispers of its monsters in fear. Welcome to History's Monsters. Rome, the beating heart of an empire. Its streets pulsed with power, politics, and whispers of betrayal. But behind the marble and gold lay a darkness that would one day consume the city itself. At the center of this storm was a boy destined to become emperor, Nero. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, crowned emperor at just 16. The people cheered, the Senate obeyed, and Rome seemed secure. But power has a way of revealing the deepest cracks within a man's soul. And in Nero, those cracks would split wide open. To some, he was a visionary artist, a performer who wanted to transform Rome into a stage. To others, he was a sadistic tyrant, a man who murdered his own family, set the city ablaze, and unleashed horrors on its people. History remembers him as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned. Whether true or not, his reign left scars that would haunt the empire for generations. This is not just the story of a man. It is the story of power without restraint. Join us as we descend into the twisted world of Nero, the tyrant who turned the eternal city into a nightmare. This is the tale of ambition, madness, and blood. This is History's Monsters. 37 AD, in a Rome filled with intrigue, a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born into a family both noble and cursed. His bloodline traced back to Augustus himself, but it was also tainted by ambition, betrayal, and death. This boy would one day be known as Nero. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was relentless, a woman as feared as she was admired. Her ambition would shape her son's destiny. From the moment he drew breath, Lucius was more than just a child. He was a pawn in Rome's deadly game of power. Lucius' father died when he was just 2 years old, leaving Agrippina widowed and politically vulnerable. But weakness was not in her nature. She maneuvered through the dangerous politics of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, waiting for her chance to place her son on Rome's throne. When Emperor Caligula Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Agrippina's brother, turned against her, she was exiled, and Lucius was stripped of protection. The boy grew up in the shadow of fear, learning early that survival meant patience, and patience could be deadly. Fortune turned again when Claudius became emperor. Agrippina returned to Rome, married her uncle, and secured her son's adoption. Lucius became Nero Claudius Caesar, heir to the empire. At just 16, he was crowned emperor of Rome, a boy at the head of the world. Most historians believe it is very likely that Agrippina the Younger poisoned Claudius, though absolute proof is impossible. The people celebrated their new emperor. Nero was handsome, youthful, and full of promise. Coins were struck with his image, statues raised in his honor. To the Roman people, this boy emperor represented hope for a new golden age. At first, Nero ruled wisely, guided by capable advisors like Seneca and Burrus. Taxes were lowered, games were held, and Rome prospered. But in the shadows, Agrippina hovered, determined to control the son she had made emperor. Agrippina's hold over Nero was iron. She appeared with him at public events, received foreign ambassadors, and acted as if she were co-emperor. The boy who would be emperor was still his mother's creation, and that truth began to eat at him. Whispers began to circulate in Rome. Was Nero truly ruling, or was Agrippina pulling the strings? Senators watched nervously, and Nero himself began to dream of a life free from his mother's grip. In these early years, Nero stood at a crossroads, the promise of a just ruler on one side, and the path of blood and terror on the other. The boy who would be emperor was about to become the man who would terrify Rome. The Palace of Rome was no place for innocence. Behind the marble columns and gilded halls lurked ambition, treachery, and whispers of death. Nero, still a boy on the throne, was surrounded by enemies both real and imagined. And the most dangerous of them all was the woman who had put him there, his own mother. Agrippina the Younger had guided Nero's rise with ruthless determination. But now, she demanded more, the right to co-rule. She placed herself beside her son on official occasions, greeted ambassadors, and interfered in decisions of state. To Nero, the empire was slipping from his grasp into her iron hands. The court watched in silence as the struggle unfolded. Was Rome ruled by a teenage emperor or by the empress mother who refused to step aside? Whispers filled the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and the city streets. The boy emperor's pride began to curdle into resentment. Nero's advisors, Seneca and Burrus, urged him to act. They warned that Agrippina's power threatened his own survival. A son who remained his mother's puppet would soon lose the loyalty of Rome. To secure his throne, Nero would have to do the unthinkable, strike against the woman who gave him life. The first victim was Britannicus, Claudius' true son, a boy only a year younger than Nero. During a banquet, Britannicus suddenly collapsed, gasping for breath. The poison had worked quickly. Rome understood the message. There would be no rival claimants to the throne. After Britannicus, Nero turned his gaze back to Agrippina. She had raised him to rule, but now she was his greatest threat. He ordered her stripped of her guards, her influence, her power. Yet Agrippina was no ordinary woman. She would not go quietly into the shadows. Nero plotted her death with cold precision. At first, he tried subtlety, sending her gifts laced with poison. But Agrippina was too cunning, too experienced in the art of survival. She drank cautiously, ate sparingly, and escaped his first traps with ease. So Nero devised a darker plan, one as theatrical as it was cruel. He invited Agrippina to a festival and arranged for her to return by boat. But this was no ordinary vessel. Beneath its painted hull lay a deadly mechanism designed to collapse, sinking her into the sea. The ship collapsed as planned. Agrippina plunged into the water, struggling among the wreckage. Yet fate defied Nero. She swam to shore and survived, wounded but unbroken. Rome whispered in awe. The empress mother had cheated death itself. Cornered and desperate, Nero sent assassins to finish what poison and shipwreck could not. Agrippina was struck down in her villa, her life ended by her own son's command. With her death, Nero was free, but he had crossed a line Rome would never forget. With his mother gone, Nero no longer felt bound by the traditions of Rome. He was emperor, free to shape the empire in his own image. But what Rome received was not the stern ruler of its Senate's imagination. Instead, they found themselves subject to the whims of a boy who dreamed of applause. Nero longed not for military triumphs or statesman's glory, but for the stage. He adored the arts, music, poetry, theater. In his mind, he was not just emperor, but Rome's greatest performer. The empire itself would become his audience, whether it wished to watch or not. He performed publicly, something no Roman emperor had ever dared. To the aristocracy, it was shameful, the emperor lowering himself to the profession of actors and musicians. But to Nero, it was destiny. He was not ruler and artist separately. He was both, united in spectacle. At first, his performances were private, confined to the elite. But soon he demanded vast audiences. Senators, generals, and even visiting dignitaries were forced to sit through hours of Nero's singing and recitals. None dared leave until he finished, no matter how long he played. Nero's vanity was boundless. He wore elaborate costumes of gold and silk, painted his face, and paraded himself like a god. To many Romans, this was more than humiliation, it was sacrilege. An emperor should command legions, not beg for applause. Yet the crowd clapped, not out of admiration, but out of fear. To displease Nero was dangerous. Those who yawned, whispered, or failed to praise loudly enough were punished. The empire's ruler demanded not just obedience, he demanded ovations. The artist emperor also entered chariot races, another passion scandalizing the elite. Dressed in dazzling costumes, he raced before his people, demanding cheers as though Rome itself were his circus. Victory was always guaranteed. Who dared risk beating the emperor? Behind the spectacle, Rome's foundations began to crack. Funds poured into Nero's indulgences, extravagant games, massive theaters, endless performances. Senators grumbled in silence, soldiers muttered at the waist, but none dared challenge the emperor's obsession. Nero dressed himself as gods and heroes: Apollo, Hercules, Dionysus. He was no longer simply emperor. He was performer, conqueror, deity, all in one. But with every performance, he drifted further from Rome's traditions, further from restraint, further from sanity. Rome had crowned a boy king. Now, it watched uneasily as that boy turned the empire into a theater of vanity. The applause still rang in Nero's ears, but beyond the stage, the city smoldered with discontent. And soon, the flames would no longer be metaphor. Rome, July of 64 AD. The summer was dry, the wind unforgiving. In the tightly packed wooden streets of the capital, disaster was waiting. On a single night, in the Circus Maximus, flames sparked, and soon, an inferno consumed the eternal city. The fire raged for 6 days, devouring homes, temples, and markets. It spread faster than any bucket line could contain. Panic swept through the city as families carried what they could, or perished in the choking smoke. For many Romans, it seemed like the end of the world. The gods themselves, they whispered, must have turned against Nero's reign. Yet amid the chaos, rumors began to spread. Who had started this fire? All eyes turned to the emperor. Nero, they said, had long dreamed of rebuilding Rome in his own vision, a golden city rising from ashes. Was it coincidence, then, that the city burned so completely, clearing land for his grand projects? Legend claims Nero stood upon his palace roof, watching the flames consume the capital, strumming his lyre, and singing of Troy's destruction. True or not, the story burned itself into history. Nero the artist, delighting as Rome fell. When the flames subsided, devastation remained. 3 of Rome's 14 districts were leveled completely, 7 more heavily damaged. Tens of thousands were left homeless. The city was a ruin, blackened bones of buildings and ash-covered corpses. Yet Nero wasted no time. He seized vast tracts of cleared land, constructing his Domus Aurea, the Golden House. With gilded walls, artificial lakes, and towering colonnades, It was less a palace than a monument to his vanity. The people's suspicion deepened. Rome had burned, and Nero had profited. The whispers grew louder. Their emperor had not just failed to save the city, he had orchestrated its destruction for his own gain. The fire that ravaged Rome did more than consume buildings. It consumed trust. Nero's reign would never recover from the suspicion. From this moment on, he was not just a performer or tyrant, but a monster who had watched his empire burn. After the Great Fire, Nero needed a scapegoat to deflect blame. His eyes fell upon the Christians, a small, misunderstood sect seen as subversive by Roman society. Their beliefs, their secrecy, and their refusal to worship Rome's gods made them perfect targets for his cruelty. Nero's vengeance was theatrical and merciless. Christians were seized, paraded through streets, and accused of burning the city. They were forced to endure public humiliation, stripped, beaten, or mocked for entertainment, as Rome's citizens watched in fearful silence. The emperor's cruelty escalated. Christians were crucified, burned alive, or thrown to wild animals in the arena. At night, they were tied to poles and set aflame to illuminate Nero's gardens, their screams lighting the sky like living torches. Romans whispered in horror and awe. The city had never seen such public spectacles of suffering. Yet Nero appeared indifferent, even delighted. To him, the screams were music, the suffering an instrument of power. Even children were not spared. Boys and girls, accused of heresy, were bound and thrown to beasts or left to perish in the flames. The moral fabric of Rome was stained by the blood of innocents. Nero justified his actions as punishment for rebellion, as deterrence for dissent, but his cruelty had no bounds. The Christians were scapegoats, tools for a ruler whose paranoia and vanity demanded absolute control. Families were torn apart. Mothers wept as fathers were executed. Children screamed as their parents were dragged away. Rome's population became spectators to a nightmare orchestrated by their own emperor. Some Christians fled, hiding in catacombs beneath the city. There, in dark, silent corridors, they whispered prayers and tried to survive the emperor's wrath. Rome above thrived on terror, while underground, the faithful endured in secret. The persecution cemented Nero's image as a tyrant in history. Stories of his cruelty spread far beyond Rome, painting a picture of an emperor who used fear as a weapon and whose whims could kill without trial or reason. Rome learned a dark lesson. Power unchecked leads to unimaginable cruelty. The Christian suffering was only the beginning of Nero's descent into paranoia and violence, a shadow that would darken the empire for years to come. By the mid-60s AD, Nero's reign was stained with blood. The fire had left scars upon Rome, and the persecution of Christians had terrified the city. Yet beneath the emperor's gilded palace, shadows grew. Paranoia gnawed at him, whispering that enemies lurked everywhere. Nero trusted no one. Senators, generals, even his closest advisors became potential traitors in his mind. Whispers of rebellion, real or imagined, fueled a frenzy of fear. The emperor's suspicion demanded blood. Old allies were destroyed without hesitation. The emperor who once performed on stage now played with lives, turning Rome itself into a theater of executions. Trials were a formality, verdicts already written in blood. Agrippina was long gone, but her memory haunted him. He had killed his own mother, his wife, his tutor, and still he felt the empire plotting against him. The ghosts of his crimes walked beside him in every corridor. Poets, philosophers, and nobles alike fell to his wrath. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, once Nero's teacher, was forced into suicide, a cruel end for a man who had tried to guide the young emperor toward virtue. Fear was everywhere. Families whispered in silence, neighbors spied upon neighbors, and even the loyal trembled. The emperor's paranoia meant that innocence was no protection. Anyone could be accused, anyone could die. Nero's purges were not just about survival, they were about control. By killing the influential and silencing dissent, he carved away Rome's backbone, leaving only those too terrified to resist him. Executions became public spectacle. Heads rolled in the forum, blood pooled on marble steps, and Rome watched in stunned silence as its emperor devoured his own empire from within. Each death only deepened the emperor's paranoia. Every ally removed created another shadow to fear. The empire had no stability, only the fragile rule of a man consumed by terror of betrayal. The purges hollowed Rome, but the emperor's fears could not be silenced. Soon, paranoia would give way to revolt, and the empire would rise against its own monster. By 68 AD, Nero's empire was unraveling. His paranoia had silenced Rome's Senate, but beyond the city, the legions whispered of revolt. Rome's provinces, weary of executions and extravagance, began to turn against their emperor. In Gaul, Spain, and Africa, governors raised their standards against him. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, grew restless. Nero's authority cracked, his image of godlike power reduced to desperation. Nero tried to win back loyalty the only way he knew, through spectacle. He planned elaborate games, performances, and festivals, but the people no longer applauded. They wanted bread, stability, and order, not a tyrant actor. As the provinces declared him an enemy of the state, Nero wandered his gilded palace in disbelief. The empire he had set aflame, silenced, and bent to his will was slipping from his grasp. The Senate declared him a public enemy. The emperor who once demanded ovations now found himself condemned by the very institution he had humiliated. In Rome, whispers grew louder. Nero would be replaced. Nero fled the city in disguise, wrapped in rags instead of gold. The emperor who once dressed as Apollo, as Hercules, as a god among men, now crept through shadows like a criminal. He begged his few remaining companions for loyalty, but fear outweighed devotion. One by one, allies abandoned him, leaving only silence where once there had been cheers. Cornered, Nero considered escape to the east, where he dreamed of staging performances in foreign lands. But Rome would not let him live in exile, not as emperor, not as man. Finally, in a villa outside Rome, as soldiers closed in, Nero chose his own end. With trembling hands, he drove a blade into himself, crying out, "What an artist dies in me!" With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. The emperor who had bathed Rome in blood and fire perished not as a god, not as an artist, but as a hunted man, abandoned by all. Nero's death did not end his presence in Rome. Instead, it sparked myths, rumors, and a haunting legacy that lingered for centuries. To many Romans, Nero had become less a man and more a symbol of corruption, cruelty, and chaos, a monster etched into the empire's memory. In the years following his suicide, rumors spread that Nero was not truly dead. Some claimed he would return, leading armies from the east to reclaim his throne. These false Neros emerged across the empire, feeding on fear and superstition. The myth of Nero Redivivus, Nero reborn, haunted the Roman psyche. Pretenders rose in his name, and whispers of his return became a dark undercurrent of political life, long after the tyrant's body was gone. Historians and philosophers used Nero's memory as a warning. His reign became the ultimate symbol of unchecked excess, cruelty, and madness, a tale whispered to remind future rulers of how power could rot the soul. In Christian tradition, Nero's infamy only deepened. He was remembered as the brutal persecutor who burned believers alive and turned their suffering into spectacle. Some even linked him to the Antichrist, an eternal symbol of evil. Even centuries later, Nero's name carried a poisonous weight. Medieval chroniclers, church fathers, and poets alike invoked him as a monster king, the archetype of depraved rulers. His shadow stretched far beyond Rome. Yet, amidst the horror, some Romans remembered his reign for its extravagance: the games, the theater, the golden palace. But even these gifts were seen as self-indulgent excess that bankrupted the empire. Nero's life became a tale of contradictions, an emperor who wanted to be loved as an artist, yet ruled with fear and blood. His vanity left monuments, but his cruelty left scars deeper than stone. To this day, Nero remains the very definition of Rome's dark side, an emperor remembered not for glory, but for horror. His name is synonymous with tyranny, debauchery, and fire. Nero's legacy endures not as a ruler, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how ambition without restraint, power without mercy, and art twisted by cruelty can turn a man into a monster. Nero's reign ended with chaos, betrayal, and his own desperate suicide. Yet his shadow lingered long after his body was gone. To Rome, he became a phantom, a name cursed, invoked, and remembered as the embodiment of cruelty and decadence. His story is one of warning more than remembrance. Across centuries, his name lived on as a symbol of tyranny. Chroniclers painted him as a man consumed by paranoia and debauchery, while Christians immortalized him as a persecutor whose cruelty etched their faith in fire and blood. Nero's monuments crumbled, his palaces decayed, but his legend endured. To later rulers, his excesses stood as a warning that unchecked power and indulgence robbed both the ruler and the state. Rome's greatest empire carried scars of his madness. His legacy was not art, nor empire, but infamy. Nero became a figure of horror, Rome's monster emperor, remembered less for what he built and more for the darkness he unleashed upon his people. The echoes of Nero's reign still speak to us, of the dangers of unchecked vanity, the cruelty of absolute power, and the fragility of civilization under tyranny. His life reminds us that monsters are not only born, they are made through ambition without restraint.